Today we are joined by the Minister of Police Oversight and Community Safety, Reagen Allen, to discuss a very topical matter of devolution. Minister Allen will unpack what devolution is, why the Western Cape government is adamant that it should occur, and how it will strengthen crime-fighting efforts in the province. I've heard your voice now on many sound bites in the news, and sometimes under very negative circumstances with what's been happening in terms of crime and all of that. But it's lovely to meet you in person now. Minister Allen, welcome.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I am delighted to be here. Devolution is a key priority, knowing that we are actually needing to bring policing closer to the people and not for choices to be made all the way in Pretoria. So I'm happy for us to have this discussion.
Now, I've heard the term devolution now being spoken about quite a bit in the news, and I must admit, I'm not one of those people that's going to pretend to know everything. So I'm very comfortable in saying when I don't know what something is. And when I first heard the term, I didn't know what it is. So for the layman, if you could just explain what devolution is, especially in the context now of what you were referring to, what in the context of policing powers and what it entails.
Currently, our constitution allows for national competencies. Listeners will be aware, for example, Home Affairs will be a national competency, so it will be managed. The executive power will be at a national level. Sadly, Home Affairs has failed. We have seen where there's national competencies like the South African Police Service. Also at a national level, policy choices are made at a national level affecting all provinces. We have seen SAPS failing. We are calling for devolution, where powers are ultimately transferred to a provincial or a local government, meaning those powers will be closer to the people. The policing needs and priorities of that particular province will be able to be taken into account so that we bring policing powers closer to the people and make choices as the executive in the Western Cape to ensure that we can actually have a professional police service, a dedicated police service, and a police service that is fully capacitated and that can actually fulfill its mandate. The South African Police Service and the previous National Commissioner in Parliament on the record saying that the South African Police Service is unable to fulfill its mandate. We are saying bring that particular power closer to the people, to the province, and not all the way in Pretoria, which is 1,500 kilometers away from where we are sitting.
It sounds like a very good plan in theory and in principle. But what has, and I'm sure there are pros and cons to both situations, but what has the Western Cape government done to in any way demonstrate that they are ready to manage the South African Police Service, given that it is essentially what you want from devolution? Yeah.
I will answer that particular question in two parts.
Okay.
On the one hand, as a Western Cape government, we would have powers in terms of education and in health. And we have shown that where we govern, we are able to govern effectively. On the one hand, we have also stepped in and stepped up by providing funding to ensure that there is LEAP officers in our priority areas. We have a payment transfer agreement with the City of Cape Town, and 13 of our priority areas in our entire province is situated in the City of Cape Town. Guguletu, Nyanga, Mitchell's Plain, and other areas. Those areas where we deploy our LEAP officers, and LEAP officers stand for Law Enforcement Advancement Plan. And we have showed where our LEAP officers are stationed, where they are deployed, we are seeing murders being reduced. Since January up until April, the only province with a 14.1% reduction, the only province with a double-digit decrease in murders. From April up until June, it was a 5.5% reduction. That amounts to 198 fewer people being murdered because the LEAP officers work with the South African Police Service, and it's based on a data-led and evidence-based approach. So we deploy our officers in a proactive way to ensure that we can actually curb crime, that we can actually prevent crime, that we can actually ensure that residents feel safer. So we have stepped in that regard. But also on the other hand, we have ramped up our oversight. The Premier was very clear when I was appointed 521 days ago, and I'm counting.
Has it been 521 days now? Really?
And I'm counting because I know we literally don't have time. Because many communities are aching, many communities are crying out for a professional police service. And over these last 520 days, it was very clear for me to ensure that our oversight must lead to better service delivery by bringing the South African Police Service at the provincial level so much closer to the Western Cape government so that we can actually see oversight leads to better service delivery. And in that particular way, we have successfully showed that when policing powers is closer to the people, we are able to make decisions, choices, and ensure there is no form of skewed allocations. If I look at the area of Delft, for example, that particular area has X amount of South African Police Service members. We have deployed almost 50% of that same amount in the area of Delft because the South African Police Service, sadly, in my estimation, is 20 years behind in terms of the actual resource allocation that we need. So we have stepped in to ensure that we can actually create further visibility, but also show that where our LEAP officers are working with the South African Police Service, we are actually seeing reductions in murders.
That was actually going to answer my next question, because I was going to ask, like, have these interventions achieved any successes? But you have now displayed that in the stats. And it's almost like... And I'm glad you're talking about proper allocation of resources, because so many times what comes from the people is they say that sometimes in certain instances police overstep, and in other instances they are invisible or not where they, where's the police now? Like, why don't you solve this crime and that crime, or deal with bigger issues? You're dealing maybe with something that's very small. Is that also something that is being looked at in terms of if devolution is achieved, that the Western Cape government will look at?
Most definitely. We are very clear that we are needing to have a data-led approach where our SAPS officers are at certain places. They are able to then be more proactive, but it's also based on the evidence, because crime do shift at times, because we know that there is turf wars happening. We know that there is, for example, when one gang member is shot, there is potential retaliation that could lead to 5 or 6 more people being murdered. There needs to be a proactive approach in that regard, but also the investigations. Our detectives in our province is sitting with a caseload of 200 dockets per detective.
I know that because when I was in grade 10, okay, that was many years ago, and we did these job shadows and community service things that we needed to do, and we went out, some of the boys visited a police station for a day. And they said, look, this is not like the series, the TV shows and the movies where a pair of detectives are going to focus on one case for, a whole week or so. You have like 150 to 200 cases open that you need to deal with.
And it's humanly impossible. I've often said, now that you are making that comment, I've often said our detectives are not like CSI. A case is not from point 1 up until the end where there's a conviction in less than 60 minutes.
Yeah.
It takes time, and we would want to have our detectives fully capacitated. We would want to ensure that detectives can ultimately investigate crime, make sure that gang members, high flyers, rapists are actually behind bars. We have an initiative called the Court Watching Brief. And that particular initiative is now also going to be rolled out across the country because of the successes here in the Western Cape. We have advocates in our department that monitor a number of court cases, and they look at inefficiencies from the detective services, whether the docket is at court, whether the statements is all in the docket, or whether there has been any gaps in that particular investigation. Because I've literally seen in some of those reports where certain cases are postponed to the next month, leading to secondary victimization, and eventually it's struck off the court roll. We would want to see justice.
And that's what I've been telling people, if there's one thing you can say about a court case in South Africa is that it's going to be postponed. Because in every news bulletin you hear, the case has been postponed to next month or 2 months, and that's why court cases take years to complete. Now, coming back to the look of if you are successful in achieving devolution, what is SAPS going to look like though under the Western Cape government? Is it going to be like in the States they have like NYPD and LAPD, so it's split up in cities where they have different names, but it's still the police. Is it going to be something like that, or is it still going to be SAPS, or what is it going to look like?
It will still be the police service, but it will be a professional one. It will be a dedicated one. It
Okay.
will be a one where we ramp up training, where we would want to see all our SAPS members are sufficiently trained. We would want to make sure that the vetting of each and every SAPS member actually takes place. We wouldn't want any particular person that is affiliated or linked to gangs to be part of the service. We would also want to make sure that skewed allocations is addressed. By skewed allocations, what I mean is that some of our precincts have a police to population ratio of 1 officer for over 1,000 members. Over 1,000 members. And I can take you to Cluttersville. There's other stations that will have 1 police member for every 800 residents in a priority area like Harare. And that is not what we would want. We would want to ensure that there's a fair allocation where the data is looked at. And the data comprise of our crime stats, but also the evidence that one collect in a particular precinct to ensure that we know where officers must be so that it can be a proactive approach to prevent crime, to ultimately combat crime. But also, to be very clear, we would want to make sure that our SAPS members and the morale of our SAPS members are there to serve and protect. I hear too many officers, capable officers, needing to do the job of 3 or 4 or 5 people, and they lose their will. They become disgruntled because they have seen here's a system that is potentially, like I've indicated earlier, 20 years behind in terms of the allocation that we actually need at a police station at any given time. So we would want to ensure the training, the visibility, but also it's a proactive approach towards policing, because we have seen in our engagements across the country, devolution is gaining ground. In Gauteng, the Premier is referring to a new policing model. And I know devolution, like you have indicated in the beginning, many will not potentially understand what it means, but it ultimately means a new policing model where we are doing the same thing since 1994, where police is at a national level, and we have seen gang members become more emboldened. We have seen criminals getting off the hook, and we would want to ensure that there is a police service that is also respected.
The National Minister of Police, though, Becky Cele, has said that you're barking up the wrong tree. You can forget about devolution. So what is your response to that?
I've said this to the National Minister in person. I've said it on public platforms as well. The Constitution does allow for that particular framework.
Okay.
Policy, in terms of the South African Police Service, sits with the National Minister. And that particular policy can ultimately be signed off to a provincial government or to a local municipality like the City of Cape Town.
Okay.
He ultimately has the power to make that policy decision so that we can actually see our residents be safer, so that we can actually see that there is a police service that becomes more credible. One of the aspects that we have also undertaken here in the Western Cape, for example, is the only province to have a police ombudsman.
Okay.
Where the ombudsman look at inefficiencies, service delivery complaints, because it is there to strengthen the hand of the South African Police Service. We would not want any SAPS member to not do his or her job. I wouldn't not want to do my job. We all have a role to play. The entire criminal justice system has a role to play, from detectives, from the South African Police Service, all the way to the courts. And that particular justice system must ultimately ensure that they work for the survivor, for the victim, so that justice can be served. And the police ombudsman does amazing work in looking at these complaints, but also then making recommendations to the South African Police Service to ensure that there is ultimately accountability.
Finally, Minister, what are the next steps now? What are some of the steps that you've now, or either already taken to achieve devolution, and also what are your options? What are the next steps for you?
We will definitely continue. We have a key date in next year, and I would call upon listeners to be informed, to make a wise decision, because we do know that policy and choices in terms of legislation is made at the national level in terms of policing. But voting next year is so important. But also from our side, we will continue to ensure that where LEAP officers are deployed, We work closely with the South African Police Service, but we extend our oversight role because we are wanting to see that there's better service delivery. I've personally visited so many South African Police Service stations. I even conduct morning parades at 5:45 in the morning because we are wanting to see that those particular parades are actually conducted because it paves the way for the work that needs to happen in that particular precinct for the day. And if a parade in the morning does not happen, if the briefing does not happen, it doesn't bode well for citizens. We conduct these oversight visits not to slam SAPS, not to hammer SAPS, but to ultimately ensure that there is service delivery, because the Constitution in the current framework allows for that oversight. But we are stepping in to ensure that we are credible in our call. I would always want to be credible in the call, and I firmly believe the drafters of our Constitution envisaged that at a particular time there will be devolution of policing powers closer to the people and not all the way at the national level. And we have seen, I can name, correctional services is a national competency, and we hear all too often about offenders being paroled and then reoffending. So correctional services, in terms of their work to rehabilitate offenders, is sadly lacking. We have seen SAPS. I've named Home Affairs. So national competencies, to a large extent, that affect provinces have been failing in our country for many, many years. We would want to ensure that policing powers is closer to the people so that we can have someone from Mitchell's Plain like myself, that we can have someone from Belhar, that we can have someone from Delft, can feel safer, can walk to a bus stop to get to and from work, and that a young person from Manenberg doesn't need to fear that a stray bullet will ultimately hit him or her, like we've seen a 9-year-old just a few weeks ago. We would want to bring safety, and the Western Cape Safety Plan directly speaks about, on the one hand, it's a law enforcement component, but also the violence prevention, the work that education is needing to do, social development is needing to do, and cultural affairs and sport, to ensure that it is that whole of government approach, whole of society approach.
Well, this has certainly opened my mind up, and Minister of Police Oversight and Community Safety, Reagen Allen, thank you so much for joining us today. That's really opened my mind. I hope it's opened yours as well.